Welcome, everybody. I am Eric Wittenberg. I am the program coordinator for the Chambersburg Civil War Seminars and Tours. Welcome to our bi-monthly history talks. You're here for an interesting program this evening. This is our first one that does not specifically deal with the Civil War, and in fact is dealing, excuse me, with topics other than the Civil War. So thanks for coming along for the experiment. Upcoming programs include some interesting talks on the 15th and 30th of each month on all sorts of different subjects. We'll be having some discussion about some Revolutionary War topics at one of our upcoming programs here shortly, and lots of course, Civil War stuff. We also have a virtual one-day conference coming up the last weekend in April on the Philadelphia campaign of 1777. During the American Revolution. Unfortunately, we did not get 50 people sign up to do the full weekend event, so we're instead converting it to a one-day program, and I hope to see some of you there. Our speaker this evening is Frederic C. Wagner III. Fred is a graduate of Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. He spent 10 years as an officer in the regular Army and as an officer in the New York National Guard. He's a former paratrooper, Army Ranger, and Special Forces trained psychological operations specialist. He's a decorated Vietnam combat veteran and company commander. He was the on-the-ground commander of the first infiltration convoys of the Vietnam War and wrote the divisional standing operating procedures, in other words, SOP, manual for convoy operations in a guerrilla warfare environment, 1st Infantry Division, Dien, Vietnam, 1966-67. He left the regular Army as a captain, spent 24 years on Wall Street as a senior executive, manager, and government securities and commodities broker. He's a former associate member of the Western Writers of America. He's a member of the editorial board of the Little Bighorn Associates, Research Review since 2009, and Fred's third book on the Battle of the Little Bighorn has just been released, is my understanding, Fred, and it deals with this evening's topic, which is Major Marcus Reno's Valley fight at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. So, join me in welcoming Fred. Fred, it's all yours.
Okay. By the way, that the Kindle version apparently is available. Somebody on Facebook has mentioned that he was starting it. The print version, I believe, is on the way. I've been told it's going to be out before Easter. Anyway, what I'd like to do is since a lot of you are not familiar or may not be familiar with the Little Bighorn battle, I'd like to break this into 3 little segments, giving you a bunch of facts and figures first, and then giving you a rundown of the traditional reading or the traditional discussion of the Valley fight, and then break that down and tell you how I differ from that traditional view of the fight. In 1876, the TO&E strength of a cavalry regiment of 12 companies was 888 men. 888 officers and men. At the Little Bighorn, it was the first time that in the 10-year history of the regiment, pardon me, that all 12 companies were together, and it consisted of 607 officers and men, 576 enlisted personnel, 31 officers, and then that command was augmented by another 48 people, primarily Indian scouts from 3 different tribes, as well as a couple of contract surgeons and some interpreters and some white scouts, a total of 655 personnel at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. These fellows were tasked with bringing back what were termed as the winter roamers, which were recalcitrant Sioux Indians under the leadership of people like Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull and Gall. And these were Indians who refused to accept the treaties, who refused to come to the reservations, who refused to come to the various agencies. And the 7th Cavalry, along with several other units, were tasked with rounding them up and bringing them to these agencies by whatever means necessary. The intelligence estimates of the strength of these recalcitrant winter roamers were pretty consistent over the period of operations that the 7th was in the field, which was about 40 days before the battle. It was estimated that these recalcitrants numbered about 400 lodges, possibly as many as 3,000 people, and somewhere in the vicinity of 800 warriors. George Custer, however, being a little bit smarter than a lot of them, figured that the agencies would wind up losing a number of younger bucks to who would wander out away from the agencies and join these winter roamers. And Custer himself figured he would meet up with some 1,300 to 1,500 Indians, warriors. Facts turned out to be a little bit different. We have been able to come up with, based on census data and various other things, we have been able to figure out that instead of 400 lodges, they really wound up meeting something close to 1,500 lodges. The village along the Little Bighorn River turned out to be about 1.5 miles in length. And instead of 3,000 people, they wound up meeting about 9,000 people. And instead of 800 to 1,500 warriors, the estimates, which are a little bit murkier than the total number of lodges and the total number of people, but somewhere in the range of 3,500 plus warriors. The battlefield itself was huge. The battle consisted of a 2-day fight. The first day was 2 separate mobile operations. The second day turned out to be a siege. Pardon me. And the fighting itself took place over a field of about 5 miles in length. If you consider, however, where Indians were first spotted, where Custer made his decision to attack and move to contact, the battlefield turned out to be closer to 20 miles in length. Consisted of about a 12-mile approach to the river, a dogleg to the right, and then up the, or I should say down the Little Bighorn Valley to about a distance of 8 miles. The command was in the field for about 40 days. And they were tasked on the 22nd of June with finding the Indians. They had finally located them in what they believe was the lower Little Bighorn, or the upper Little Bighorn Valley. And Custer moved for the next couple of days up until the 25th, was planning on attacking on the 26th in conjunction with another force, which was going to be moving up the Little Bighorn Valley. But instead, because he was afraid that he had been sighted, he had been spotted, and the Indians would break and run, he decided to attack on the 25th itself. At noon, he broke his regiment down into 5 separate commands, 5 separate battalions. One of them was under the command of a captain named Fred Benteen, consisted of 3 companies, and he sent it off to the southwest as a reconnaissance and force to make sure that there were no Indians that would threaten Custer's flanks. He also took a company as the rear guard, and he attached it to a 175 mule pack train. He took the rest of the companies, the 8 remaining companies, and he broke them down into 3 separate battalions, 2 of which unequal battalions he took with himself, and the 3rd he sent with his senior officer, a major by the name of Marcus Albert Reno. Reno's command consisted of 3 companies, companies A, companies G, and company M. And between Reno's command and Custer's command, they moved down what we call today Reno Creek, which was about 12 miles to the river, to the Little Bighorn River. They moved about 10 miles and they came upon a teepee. It was a standing teepee with a broken down teepee adjacent to it in a campsite that the Indians had abandoned only a few days before. Adjacent to that teepee was a knoll, and on the knoll were several of the troops ran up to the knoll. A couple of the scouts ran up to the knoll, and they spotted Indians, about 50 Indians, about a mile ahead of themselves, still in that Reno Creek Valley. Pardon me. They spotted about 40 or 50 of these Indians. And one of the scouts turned to Custer, yelled down to Custer, and he yelled out, "There go your Indians, General, running. There go your Indians, General, running like devils." They also spotted a lot of dust rising in the Little Bighorn Valley. Now remember, they're about 2 miles from the river. Custer ordered Reno ahead to attack or to follow and attack these 40 to 50 Indians. At this point, the controversy begins and the damnation of Marcus Reno starts, because Reno was never tasked with attacking the village per se. He was only tasked with going after and bringing these Indians to battle. The precise orders that he was given, and this is supported by about 13 different people who were there, whether they were white scouts or troops or officers, regardless, it made no difference. He was tasked with an order by his adjutant to basically as follows. The Indians are about 2.5 miles ahead on the jump. Follow them as fast as you can and charge them wherever you find them, and we will support you. He was never tasked with attacking the village. And one of the condemnations of Reno, one of the major items that people always go after Reno about, besides being drunk, besides being a coward, was the fact that he disobeyed orders. But nowhere in these orders was the word village ever mentioned. Now, it doesn't take a genius to figure if Reno's going down the rest of the Reno Creek Valley, he's going to turn into the Little Bighorn Valley, he's going to bring these Indians to battle, he won't eventually reach the village. But the village itself was never part of Reno's orders. Or what was part of Reno's orders was the idea that he was going to be supported by the entire regiment, the remaining 5 companies. So basically it was going to be a 1-2 punch. Reno would bring them to battle, Custer would follow down the valley and attack, run through Reno and attack as well. Once he got these orders, Reno took off with some alacrity. He crossed the river, he went through the brush, and he brought his troops into battle formation. He had 3 companies, Company A, Company G, and Company M. He lined up A and M. He put G in reserve, and he started to move down the valley, and then almost immediately he brought G up in the line as well. So what he was faced with now was G on the left, A in the middle, and M on the right. The traditional view of this battle is these troops in line go charging down this valley about 2.5 or 3 miles. Suddenly Reno calls a halt, stops the command, they dismount, he moves his horses into a timbered area, and the troops start to advance on foot. They move 100 yards, they move 200 yards. The Indians are in front of them. The Indians are pulling back. The Indians are basically all on foot with the exception of these 40 or 50 Indian warriors. Suddenly, Indians bolt out of the village, grab horses, and they start to flank Reno. He pulls his troops back into the timbered area. He fights in the timber for about 10 minutes or so. He orders a retreat. It's a panic retreat. They tear out of the timber. He goes rushing back up the valley. They get forced into the river. He gets slaughtered in the river. They cross, the remaining troops cross the river. They mount the bluffs, and they're rescued by Benteen, who has suddenly appeared. That is the traditional view. It stood the test of time for 140 some odd years, but there are too many problems with it, too many issues with it, too many participant accounts that are never taken into consideration. And Reno, because of these actions, because of the panic retreat out of this timbered area, he is labeled a coward. He is accused of being drunk, and he's accused of not following Custer's orders to attack the village. That's the scenario in a nutshell. The problem is under real tight scrutiny, it doesn't hold up. So let's go right back to where they found this teepee. They had gone down this valley for about 10 miles, and they reached this teepee. In the Reno Creek Valley, which is an east-west running valley, this group of Indians had camped there for several days. They left that camp, they moved into the Little Bighorn, and they camped there. They then turned around and they moved down the river rather than back up, which was their initial intention, to the point where they were finally met by Custer's command, or by Reno's command. At the teepee, and we have accounts that attest to this, Custer issued an order for Reno, as I told you. The Indians are about 2.5 miles on the jump. Attack them, we'll support you. He did this through his adjutant. This did not seem to be a problem at the time. Reno moved ahead. He was followed by the regimental adjutant. He was also followed by a guy named Miles Keogh, who happened to be in command of one of the other battalions that were running with Custer. There's a lot of debate whether or not the support that Custer proffered Reno was a direct support. In other words, Reno would go down the valley and Custer would follow behind him. But when you consider the fact that the regimental adjutant followed Reno, when you consider the fact that Keogh also went to the river to reconnoiter a crossing point, it becomes fairly clear that those were the initial intentions, and that was the support that Reno expected. So we go into the valley. Reno lines up his two companies, and he begins to move down this valley. The general idea is that he took a straight shot, he galloped, he charged down the valley, he came to a point of timber, he stopped, he dismounted. In fact, what he did do is he followed the meandering course of the river. He didn't go straight down the valley, and he never called a charge. He moved down there with some speed. He moved down at about 12 miles an hour. But what he did do is the company on the far right, M Company, under a captain by the name of Tom French, took 2 sets of 4s and began to skirmish the brush and the timber along the river. As they moved farther on down the valley, the Indians backed up, constantly backed up. Custer, rather than support Reno from the rear, had not inadvertently, but had turned off to the right because scouts had given him a report that Indians were not retreating down the valley, that they were setting up a screen, and that would indicate that they were trying to give time for families to break and run and get away. So Reno, as he's moving down the valley, and he sends the skirmishers along the timbered area along the river. He reaches a point. There's a tremendous amount of dust rising in the valley. The Indians are beginning to move back down. He can't see. He reaches a point where all of a sudden they begin to see ravines entering the valley from the southwest. This is a problem because they can't tell what's in the ravines. The traditional view shows that there is a single ravine. They don't know how many Indians are in the ravine. They don't know if there are Indians in the ravine at all, but there are indications that there are other ravines farther down the valley, and there are Indians in those ravines as well. Reno's now confronted with a situation where he has timber jutting out into the valley. He can't see the village because of the timber. He has a tremendous amount of dust rising caused by the Indians themselves. They're doing it intentionally. And now he has ravines blocking his route. And so he orders his command to halt. They dismount and they begin to pivot. So M Company pivots clockwise and starts to face off to the west, which is where the Indians kept their horses. G Company anchors itself on the edge of this timber area that is preventing Reno and the rest of his command from seeing what's beyond it, seeing the village, in other words. A Company is still in the middle and pivots clockwise to G Company's left. So now you have a situation where you have G Company on the right, A in the center, M on the left, but M moving towards the west, where A and G are swinging toward the north, crossing these ravines and firing as they go. The biggest problem now that you have is Reno has ordered these troops to dismount, and he's ordered the horses into the timber. By doing that, he has made his troops not even dragoons, but he's made them straight leg infantry. He has taken away their mobility. He has taken their mobility and he's sequestered it into the woods. This is the biggest single mistake the man made in the entire battle. As the troops move forward, George Custer, his adjutant, and one other man are spotted on the hills on the east side of the river. Now, whether Reno knows this or not, we don't know. Reno forever denied that he knew that Custer was not going to support him by a follow-up attack. Regardless, the troops are moving forward. Custer apparently, because he's seen in the valley and he's waving his hat, he's apparently pretty pleased at what he's seeing. In the meantime, you still have A and G companies moving forward. Indians are backing away. M Company, however, is moving off to the west. The traditional view claims that there were two skirmish lines, M, A, and G, and they moved from one point to another point, thereby forming the two skirmish lines. The fact is, however, you have too many accounts of the participants who are saying that M Company didn't do that, but they moved more to the west, and a gap formed between the A and G line moving north and M Company moving to the west. Eventually, M Company also pivots and starts to move north as well. So what you have now is you have the troops are moving, Indians are backing away, there's a lot of firing going on, the troops firing are not able to reach the Indians, but the Indians firing is reaching the troops. There are still no casualties, nobody's been shot, and yet there's a lot of activity. Suddenly, mounted Indians begin to appear. And what's interesting here too is that these Indians are not in large groups. The testimonies or the accounts of the troops are very, very consistent in that they say that there are essentially between 200, 300, 400 Indians in front of them, but they are in small groups, groups of twos, groups of threes, groups of fours, maybe even groups of five. Nobody's being shot, nobody's being hit. And yet a lot of firing is going on. Troops still can't see because the Indians are still raising dust, trying to create a screen so that their families can get away. And now you have gun smoke as well. Remember, cordite wasn't invented yet, so you still had, there was still no powderless smoke from the rifle fire or from the carbine fire. And you have the Indians still backing away and the troops still moving forward. Finally, however, Reno is worried about his horses in the timber. And in the meantime, I should have mentioned this earlier, but M Company did not put their horses in the timber. French kept his horses with him. This is an area of tremendous dispute. Very, very few people realize that M Company kept their horses. The whole traditional view is that everybody had their horses into the woods. But we have about 7 separate accounts alluding to the fact that M kept its horses, or at least most of its horses, with it. Don't know about the troops the M Company skirmishers who went into the timber. But eventually, Reno took part of G Company and moved those troops into the timber, followed the troops into the timber, because he was getting reports that there were Indians in that area as well. Problem here was that you now have a commander who has left the main field of battle and has wandered off with half of one of his companies into a subsidiary field, the timbered area. For what purpose, we really don't know. The threat of Indians in there could have been handled by the 10 skirmishers, the 2 sets of 4s from M Company. And if they couldn't, they would have reported out, or somebody would have come out and they would have brought Reno in. But now you have a situation in the valley where you have one company far off to the western side of the valley, and the valley is almost a mile in width. And you have 2 other companies with no real supervision other than Reno's adjutant. Eventually, several minutes later, the adjutant runs into the timber to contact Reno to say, look, we're getting some problems out here. We're getting more and more Indians, and they're mounted and they're beginning to turn your flank. What happens now is Reno comes out and suddenly makes a decision to pull everybody back into the timbered area. At the same time, and this is new, Reno has decided he's not going to defend that timber. The timber itself was extremely dense. There were only very small buffalo trails to allow troops to get by, to allow horsemen to get by. And once they reached a particular point within that timber, there was an opening in there, a glade. Some people said as much as 50 acres, but that seems to be excessive. That's the area where the horses were kept. But Reno decided, because there were no interlocking fields of fire, there was just dense, heavy brush and timber. It is my contention that as soon as Reno came back out onto the prairie, he made the decision that he was not going to defend that timbered area. He was going to retreat. He was going to pull back out. It was beginning to get really hot. M Company was getting under pressure. Tom French was starting to pull his troops back. Indians now were mounted. There were more and more and more of them. We have Indian accounts and we have white accounts who are minimizing and delineating the battlefield, which is a problem in itself. And what they're doing is they are starting to force the troops, starting to force M Company back by turning its flanks. Reno orders everybody into the woods. They come helter-skelter back. M Company mounted, G and A not mounted, and they reach a point at the edge of the timber they referred to as a brow. It was the Little Bighorn River itself had a lot of dry channels, and this particular channel was dry. And the troops lined up when they pulled back into the timber. They lined up along this brow area, and they were there for maybe 5 minutes or so, or 10 minutes or so, before Reno brought his company commanders together and told them we were going to leave this timbered area. At this point, they're in the glade, or some of the troops are in the glade, and Reno is trying to communicate with one of his Indian scouts what he should be doing, or what the Indian scout thought was going on at this particular point, what the Indians were trying to do. At that moment, warriors in the timber put a bullet in this, shot this Indian scout named Bloody Knife, and Bloody Knife's brains splattered all over Reno. At this point, it is reported, and this is another one of these controversial issues, where Reno panicked, told his troops to mount, suddenly told his troops to dismount, then told them to mount again, and confusion reigned. The fact of the matter is Reno had by this time decided he was leaving. He had instructed his company commanders to gather their troops, line them up at the edge of the timbered area, and they would take off from there. He was calling it a charge, the idea being that anytime Indians were attacked by an organized, disciplined set of troops, they would break and run and scatter. It was a chance he wanted to take. It was the only chance he could take, because by now there were Indians on the east side of the river firing at him. There were Indians on the north infiltrating the timber. There were Indians about to attack from the west, and he was now finding Indians on the south, blocking his only way of his only retreat route. He formed up his men, and they started out in a hurry. It turned into an absolute panic. Didn't start out that way. There was bumping, there was pushing. Not everybody got the word. He left 20 men in the timber. His officers didn't really serve him well. Tom French of M Company was fine. He did a good job. They broke out. The charge was led by Reno. They ran right into the face of the warriors. Initially, the warriors split apart, let the troops out, and then when they realized what was happening, that they weren't being attacked per se, that this wasn't really a charge per se, they attacked. And at the same time, apparently, according to Indian accounts, Crazy Horse hit with about 200 warriors. One of the interesting points here is, traditionally, if you are going to retreat, you retreat along the route that you know, which is basically back up the valley. The problem is there were too many Indians on Reno's right, and they were forcing him toward the river. He moved about a mile up the valley before he was forced to turn toward the river. And at the same time he was doing this, he was hit from the left, Indians along the river. This forced him into a double retreat route. And when Crazy Horse hit, he basically hit the center unit. A Company led out of the timber, G was followed, and M Company came last. When Crazy Horse hit, and it's assumed it was Crazy Horse, he hit the center of the command. Those were the troops that suffered the greatest numbers of casualties, and those were the troops who were forced into a secondary route through a swampy area, about 20, 25 of them, only of which 5 made it, crossing the river a little bit lower down. At the same time, Reno is now reaching the river. There is so much dust still being raised that it probably saved much of Reno's command from total destruction. As it was, he lost about 30% of his total command who were killed during this retreat. The most serious casualties were suffered by G Company in the middle and M Company at the end, at the tail end. They hit the river, and it was basically a bloodbath. Again, the dust, which was one of the problems that he confronted initially, was one of the things that saved him, simply because nobody could see anything. They reached the river. Again, they crossed it. The troops crossed it. Indians followed them across. They began mounting the bluffs. They reached the top of the bluffs. Many of the troops, one of the doctors and his orderly went in a slightly different direction up a different set of ravines to reach the top of the bluffs. They were killed there by Indians. And about 20 minutes after Reno reached the top of the bluffs, they saw more troops coming. Initially, he thought it was Custer coming, which you begin to wonder what some of these guys were thinking at the time, because Custer was, had been seen a half an hour or 40 minutes earlier in the exact same place, or very close to the place where Reno was now mounting the bluffs. Turned out to be Benteen, and it turned out to be the main factor that saved the remains of Reno's command. There were still Indians on the east side of the river. Indians were crossing the east side of the river. They were now between Reno's command, Benteen's arriving command, and Custer's command, which had now gone farther down the river on the east side of the Little Bighorn. "20 men were left in the timber. All but 2 of those 20 men made it out alive. 2 refused to go. Their heads were found on poles in the village after the battle was all over. As it turned out, A Company had 9 men killed, G Company had 14 men killed, M Company had 13 men killed. A total of 28.4% of Reno's command was killed, basically during the retreat. Only 1 man had been wounded in the valley fight itself. He was mortally wounded, but they had brought him up to the hilltop where he died. A couple of other men were shot and killed in the timber itself, but basically the vast majority of troops that were killed during this entire battle were killed during the retreat. The major differences between what I've just described and the traditional view are as follows. M Company, according to accounts, and I've taken more than 200 accounts of Indians and troops who are in this battle. And there are enough accounts that attest to the fact that there was a split skirmish line and that M Company retained its horses. It's important to understand this because when the pullback occurred, M Company was about 0.8 of a mile from the safety of this, or the so-called safety of the timber. Now, when you think about the fact that it's 90 some odd degrees out, when you think about the fact that you're fighting in dust, when you think about the fact that your flanks and rears are being threatened by now mounted warriors, how are these troops going to make it back into this timber if they don't have their horses? It would take entirely too long. We have 7 separate accounts, none of which are ever dealt with, that allude to the fact that M Company had those horses. We also have accounts that talk about multiple skirmish lines, not a single skirmish line in two different positions, but multiple lines. In other words, M Company itself with forming one skirmish line and the other skirmish line being formed by G Company and A Company close to the timber. So those two things alone are completely different from the traditional view. Another thing that's never brought up, and this to me is the most important thing of all, is that Reno gave up his mobility, the worst thing he could have done, because this is in fact the single thing that doomed his command. If he had maintained the mobility, if he had fought his dragoons, dismounted cavalry with their horses right behind them, he still would have had 25% of his troops not able to engage the warriors because they're holding the horses, but he would have been able to move and pull back whenever he wanted to pull back, when he felt threatened, and he would have been able to do so without going through a horde of Indians who had basically surrounded him in an area of timber that he could not defend. He couldn't defend it because it was being infiltrated. He couldn't defend it because it was being attacked from the east. He couldn't defend it because it was being attacked from the west. And he was threatened. His only retreat route was also being threatened from the south. It was too dense. He couldn't move. Testimony to that is the fact that he left 20 troops in there. They couldn't come out. He wasn't served well by his A Company commander, and he wasn't served well by his G Company commander, who paid the ultimate price when he was killed at the river. He wasn't drunk. He wasn't a coward. He led the charge out of there, and no poltroon will lead a charge in face of 250 or 300 or 400 Indians. So he wasn't a coward. But he made very, very poor tactical decisions. And he never, ever should have taken the troops off the line, gone into the timber himself, and allowed his command in the primary battle with no real commander in charge. All he had was a company commander. He had a half a company with nobody in charge of it except the lieutenant, who probably didn't even know what was going on at the time. And he had another company far across the valley, also not knowing basically what was going on other than what was immediately to his front, and then to his flanks, and then to his rear. So he made extremely poor decisions. Whether or not his choice of route in crossing the river was sound, there's a lot of debate about that. He couldn't go farther back. He couldn't go back the way he came because he was cut off. And that's basically it. He was rescued by the arrival of Benteen and 3 more companies of the 7th Cavalry. But Reno had suffered horrendous, horrendous casualties. He wasn't drunk. He wasn't a coward, but he made some serious mistakes. And I'm open for questions. Eric, it's yours.
Sorry, just a second. That's on my end. Hang on. There we go, Eric.
Thanks, Lark. Like everybody else in the room, I was muted by Lark as well, so I had to wait for her to unmute me. Fred, you've done some novel work here on this particular project, just as you did in your Strategy of Defeat book. I'd like to throw out the first question to you, which is, would you talk a little bit about your research methodology so folks understand how you've done some of the work that you've done?
Okay. To me, I've used a couple of different, to me, the most important thing is to gather the accounts of people who were there. I have put together a total of 284 accounts from people who were at the battle, who were on the campaign and showed up a day after the battle, and their contemporaries, essentially more than 200 people who were at the battle. And what I basically do is I take every single account at face value. I don't eliminate any of them. If you go through each of these accounts and you find preposterous things, then you are forced to eliminate those particular accounts. I'll give you an example. One of the best, one of the most gold-plated accounts we have has been left us by one of Reno's lieutenants, a fellow by the name of Luther Hare. Virtually everything Luther Hare says, you can take at face value, with one exception. When Reno was going down the valley, he confronted a ravine. Most accounts, in fact, every account I've ever read says that this ravine was one of the primary causes for Reno stopping and dismounting, okay? Subsequently, I have found through more research, more reading, that there wasn't just this one ravine, there were multiple ravines. The account I'm alluding to with Hare was at the Reno Court of Inquiry. He came out and he said, there were ravines ahead of us, and there were several hundred Indians pouring out of this ravine. Well, you look at that and you say, this is a crock. There's no way, because look, this battle was sharp, it was fast, it was mobile, it was vicious. There was no playing around. This was a very, very fast, mobile military operation. Hare says, you got hundreds of Indians coming out of this ravine. It's impossible. All right, it's impossible simply because the Indians they were surprised. They couldn't get this number of Indians in any particular place that quickly, unless there were multiple ravines, and those ravines were closer and closer and closer to the village itself. If you do the research, you find out that this valley has been tilled, planted, graded, plowed, fenced. There's a railroad that goes through it now. There's an interstate that goes through it now. None of the ravines exist anymore, with the exception of a short stretch of ravine, which I have taken a picture of, and which that picture is in the new book. Actually, I think it's in the strategy book as well. But when you look now at Hare's account, and he says hundreds of Indians poured out of this ravine, you can look at that and you can say, oh my God, that's right. There's something to that. He's correct. And you no longer discard that piece of information. So the most important thing in the methodology in determining all of these things is to take every single account. The horses, for example. There are 7 accounts alluding to the fact that M Company kept its horses. Yet these are never discussed. They're never brought up. I don't care where you go, no matter what you read, you will never come across these accounts. There is never anything that says M Company kept its horses, but it makes sense. Does that answer your question?
It does. I'm going to ask you one more before I start
Shoot.
giving you questions from the audience. Recently, your strategy of defeat book was used as the basis for a documentary film. Would you like to tell everybody about that?
It was used. It was used in the fact that Chris Hoffert came to me and said, hey, what should I name this? And I said, well, why don't you name it after my book, but call it Custer's Strategy of Defeat rather than name it specifically after the book per se. There's a lot of the book in it. There's a lot of other things in the movie itself that are not in the book that I would not have agreed to, but Chris used a number of different sources in putting this thing together. And so I don't want to say that it's a direct recitation of the book, because it's not. But he's been very kind, and he's given me credit. I've edited his what do you call it? A film score, movie score? What is
Script.
I don't even know.
Script.
Script, there you go. I've edited it several times, I think about 10 times, as a matter of fact. But it's basically, it's his baby. And in my opinion, from what I've seen, and I've missed 2 Zoom calls on it, on a preview, I've missed them both. But from what I've seen, it will be the most accurately depicted, the most accurately portrayed movie about the battle ever done. It'll probably even be more accurate than Son of the Morning Star, and it will be more accurate in the portrayal
Is it
itself.
available yet, Fred?
No, it's not.
Okay.
Saturday, he showed a second screening of it, but as I said, I missed it. I was
Okay.
out.
All right. David Levine asks, based on 650 cavalry and 3,500 warriors, did Custer really have any chance of success?
No, he did not. No, he did not. Now, one other thing, understand. There were 607 troops total, okay? A lot of the Indian scouts who formed the sundries, the augmentation, the 655 total in the command, they backed out of this thing. So it wasn't quite that number. Also, the 3,500 plus Indians is an overestimation. The work that I've done tells me that about a little under 2,100 Indians actually saw action. A lot of the Indians fled with the families up or down the Little Bighorn Valley, trying to get away from this maelstrom that was about to hit. So not all of those Indians got involved in the battle. It's also interesting that even though the battlefield was huge, each battle was a small piecemeal battle, and not all the Indians, and you have Indian accounts to this, not all the Indians could fit into the battle. This is particularly true of the Custer fight itself. Indians were actually sitting back, watching the fighting going on because they couldn't fit into the battlefield. It was the same thing in part of the Valley fight. And there was so much dust being raised that a lot of Indians shot one another. And this is especially true in the Custer fight. So even though you had 600 and let's say 650, 655 participants under, with the troops, you basically had a little under 2,100 Indians involved in the actual fighting between the 2 battles. Next question.
Kevin Connolly asks, excuse me, did most of the retreating troops retrieve their horses from the timber, or did the bulk of them end up retreating up the bluff on foot?
No. Almost everybody had a horse. Everybody who ran out of that timber had a horse. Some of those who left afterwards, there were 20 who were left. 18 of them got out. 2 of them didn't, or they got out, but they went in the wrong direction. Some of those did not have horses, but everybody who actually left the timber left on a horse. In fact, there was one account, I think it was an M Company trooper by the name of Galen, who actually had 2 horses and gave one of them to one of his comrades who had his horse shot out from underneath him.
Hugh Plunkett asks, how important was the inexperience and poor training, including in horsemanship, of Reno's troops?
I don't think it had anything to do with the fighting at all. I don't think it had a single thing to do with it.
Norval Wathen asks, he makes a comment and then asks a question. The comment was, maps would really help. Does your new book have maps of the various positions?
It has 2 maps. They are the same exact maps that are in the strategy book. I have always had an issue with maps. This has been my problem. The maps that are in the strategy book and that are in this are actually USGS maps that my daughter photoshopped. She took every single thing. She took the USGS map that I sent her, and she took all the features out of it, all the roads and the buildings that show up on a modern day map. She photoshopped all of them out. All she left in was the river itself and the contour lines. And then she dumped in arrows where I told her to put in the arrows, and she put crosses in where I told her to put crosses. But the two maps that are in the new book are identical with maps that are in the strategy book.
Steve Custer asks, of the 20 troops left in the timber, how many eventually made it out, when, and led by whom?
They were led by George Herendeen. All 18 of the 20 made it out. They made it out at about 5 o'clock. Now, the Reno fight began, or the Reno retreat began about 2:23 in the afternoon. That's when the retreat began. Benteen arrived at 2:55. The rest of his command arrived somewhere in the area of around 3:10. And by 5 o'clock, Herendeen had led the rest of these men out of the timbered area up towards the Ware Point area in the battlefield. So they all made it out. But a civilian scout led them.
Brian Duggan asks, do you think that the circumstances of Bloody Knife's death next to him substantially affected Reno's decision-making ability?
No, not at all. I have done a tremendous, it took me 5 years, almost 5 years to do the working on it, almost nothing else, working on nothing else but in developing this timeline that you see in the strategy book and that you will see part of in this new Valley book. Reno made the decision to leave that timber immediately upon his adjutant, Lieutenant Hodgson, and his other officers showing him what was happening in the valley. He made the decision at that point. The Bloody Knife incident may or may not have affected him. And again, it may or may not have happened as everybody thinks it happened. Now, Herendeen confronted Reno a couple of days, the scout Herendeen confronted Reno a couple of days after the battle, and he said, Major, do you remember this? And Reno admitted it to it. He says, yes, I remember it. I was there. His brain splattered all over me. The contiguous thing, or the thing that's attached to this is the so-called panic, Reno's so-called panic of mount troops, dismount, mount, all right? The old mount, dismount, mount. But there are accounts by his troops, by M Company troops who were there, who question whether or not those troops were already in the process of mounting and whether or not it was French himself or Reno who made that command to mount and then dismount and then remount. We know Reno was going to move out of there anyway. So the last mount up doesn't even count. So there's some controversy there, and you'll see it in the book, in the new book, about that mount, dismount, mount business. It's not really clear that this was an issue. It was an issue in the fact that it occurred, yes, but was it fully Reno, or was somebody else involved in the mount, dismount, mount order? And when did it actually happen? Did the first mount occur before Bloody Knife was killed, or did it occur after he was killed? So there's a lot of question about that.
Charles Yordi asks, and this should be an easy question to answer, wasn't the dismounted skirmish line a standard cavalry tactic?
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
Hugh Plunkett asks, once on the hill and joined by Benteen, why did Reno not move toward the sound of the Custer battle?
He did. All right, he did. This is another controversial issue. I mean, there's more everything in this battle is controversy, including what these guys wore. All right. Reno began arriving on the hill at about 2:35, 2:40 in the afternoon. Benteen himself arrived at 2:55. So you have somewhere between a 15 and 20-minute period from the time the first of Reno's men reached the hilltop to the time Benteen himself reached the hilltop. Now you have a situation called variable queuing, where you have a command that's strung out, and it takes time for the first man to reach a point, and then the last man to reach that same point, all right? So let's assume that Benteen finally reached, the last of his men reached the hilltop at 3:05 in the afternoon. There were Indians in their front. Benteen sent out 2 skirmish lines. He sent out one facing the north, and he sent out one facing or on the bluffs facing the Indians across the river who had chased Reno. He then asked Reno, where's Custer? That was the first thing he said, where's Custer? And he whipped out the note that he had been given and he showed it to Reno, and Reno said, I have no idea where he is. We saw him here. He's farther north. So he sends out his skirmish lines. He now has to account for the troops who are still coming up the bluffs. The last of Reno's men didn't reach the top of the bluffs until about 3:20 or so, 3:30. The pack train hadn't arrived, and Benteen was now responsible for the pack train because of that note. He had to make sure that he was between the pack train and the Indians. So that took some time. He had to account for the wounded, all right? He had to gather together the remains of A Company and M Company and G Company. According to Lieutenant Wallace, G Company had a half a dozen men. That's all he could account for, 6, 8 men. This took time. They complained they were out of ammunition. So Benteen distributed part of the ammunition his troops had, and he sent Lieutenant Hare back to the ammunition mules to hurry up and get some ammunition and get a couple of the mules up there as quickly as can be. When they did that and they saw the pack train starting to move up the bluffs, Benteen, not Reno, probably, although Benteen gives Reno the credit for it, Benteen ordered the troops, the remaining troops, his own company and the other companies, to start to move toward Custer. In the meantime, Reno, you really wonder what this guy was thinking sometimes. He decides that he's going to go hunting for his adjutant, who had been reportedly shot in the river and was either dead or was mortally wounded near the river's banks. So Reno leaves the hilltop and he's hunting for his adjutant, a guy by the name of Benny Hodgson. In the meantime, Benteen sees the packs and he starts his command towards Custer. A total of maybe, I'm going to say 45 to 50 minutes, maybe 55 minutes between the time he arrived at the hilltop and he moved north looking for Custer.
So I'm going to follow that up with a question that somebody asked, which was, from the time that they dismounted until the charge from the timber, how long elapsed?
He dismounted at 1:35. He pulled back at about 2:07. They left the timber at 2:23.
So
between
less than an hour.
1:35 and 2:23, less than an hour, but a lot more than 10 minutes that some writers and authors give them on the skirmish line and the pullout and the retreat.
Eric Norman asks, was Reno's retreat inevitable? And if so, what would an orderly, proper retreat have looked like?
One of the biggest criticisms I have about Reno, other than the fact that he lost his mobility, is the fact that he did not give his troops, his officers. And again, it wasn't Reno's responsibility to get all the A Company men together, to get all the G Company men together, to get all the M Company men together. He had officers to do that. It was the responsibility of those company commanders to get those men together. Reno's mistake in the timber was in not giving them enough time to do that. If he had taken 10 more minutes, he could have saved lives, because then he could have emphasized, or he could have had his officers, his company commanders emphasize to the men, control, 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 stay together. Let's do this right. It started out fine. There was no panic initially. The panic ensued once they hit the prairie and the Indians realized what was going on. But if they had closed up, if they had maintained a proper distance, they would have done a lot better. And I give Reno the blame for that, the fault for that, because he didn't give them enough time. Luther Hare, again, this lieutenant whose testimony, whose accounts I feel are solid gold, said that if we had stayed in there for 30 minutes more, or maybe he said 20 minutes more, we'd have never been able to get out. And I believe that, and I'm sure Reno believes it. But if Reno had given himself another 10 minutes, he would have had a much more orderly retreat. The only other way that it would have been done better is if he had maintained that mobility, had kept his horses with each of those units, with each of those companies, had left the 10 skirmishers from M Company in the timber to make sure that he wasn't going to be threatened from that flank, and he had kept his horses behind those companies, he could have retreated back up the valley, and it would have been a much more orderly retreat.
I regret that we're not going to get it to everybody's questions. So what I've done is I'm going to narrow it down here to the two that I think are the best left. And one of them, we're going to put you on the spot, Fred. Wayne Richards asks, with your military experience, would you have even engaged the Indians in such a poor geographic area? That's asking you as a military man yourself.
Here's the issue. I was a company commander. Reno had no alternative. He was obeying his orders. This is one of the things that drives me insane about this whole thing, because people say Reno did not follow his orders. He followed his orders to the T. He absolutely did, including the speed of advance. What I would have done, and again, this is something I harp on constantly. I bring it up in the book. Maybe I don't bring it up enough in the book, but I bring it up in the book, is if he had maintained that mobility. That's the whole key. This is what killed Custer's command. Custer lost his mobility. There was a difference. Custer had no choice. Reno had a choice. Custer couldn't be blamed for losing that mobility because of the situation that he found himself in. Custer made mistakes, but losing his mobility was not one of those mistakes. Reno's primary mistake was that if you have your mobility, you can get the hell out of there. There's a difference between mobility and maneuverability. So to answer the question, yes, I would have done exactly what Reno did, except I would never have gone into those woods. That going into the woods was absolutely fatal. Giving up that mobility was the worst possible thing he did, and the mistakes he made after that only compounded that initial mistake.
So the last question I'm going to throw at you is one that I think all of us will be interested to hear the answer to, which is, given the confusion of combat and the loss of time, how have you been able to pin all these things down precise minute of what took place at a given time, Fred? What's your methodology, in other words?
Right, in methodology, the most important thing you can do, I've employed a number of things. I got data from the United States Naval Observatory. I've walked the battlefield, I don't know, with my buddies Scott Nelson and Max Reeve and Michael Olson and Frank Bodden. We've walked that damn battlefield, I think 6, 7 times. We've walked it from one end to the other. We have measured distances. I've used a lot of the USGS maps, which I found superb. But the primary instrument is every single account. And you don't go specifically with a watch time because number one, they didn't have a wristwatch. They didn't have wristwatches in those days. Number two, not all the officers had watches. Number three, I don't know of any single account by any enlisted man that quotes a specific watch time. So you can look at it and say none of the enlisted men had watches. You can pinpoint times by speeds. You can pinpoint times by distances. You can pinpoint times by terrain, but the most important thing is to use the relative times of the individuals who were there. The most important thing is always those individual accounts. And I'll just give you some statistics just to boggle your mind. I have 284 separate accounts from people totaling 1,200 pages of data. I've taken that data. I have taken every single event. I've broken those down. I've put them into spreadsheets pertaining to that particular event, 37 events overall, totaling some 50,000 modules of information, or 49,700 modules of information. And from all of that stuff, you can basically pinpoint within minutes of when specific events occurred. You take all of those data and you compare them to Indian accounts. And remember, the Indian accounts are extremely important. They talk about the time it takes for the sun to pass a TP pole, or it began at noon. How do you know the battle began at noon? Well, the sun is directly overhead, so that's noon. The Indians knew what noon was, or the amount of time it took a hungry man to eat his meal. These are all important things. How long does it take a hungry man to eat his meal? It takes me 40 minutes to go through dinner. I can eat a hamburger or what in 20 minutes. So it gives me a pretty good idea of what it takes, of what those relative times encapsulate. And from there, you just build the charts. Like I said, it took 5 years to do it.
Well, it shows, and your expertise shows. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us, Fred. It's been a pleasure having you this evening. You got a tremendous volume of questions this evening, more than we normally get, and I appreciate your willingness to stick around and answer them. Folks, our next topic will be on April the 30th, will be my friend Scott Patchen. Scott will be speaking about the 1864 Battle of Lynchburg, Virginia. And our April 15 program will be Mike Harris speaking on his new book on the Battle of Germantown in the fall of 1777. And I thank everyone who attended this evening. I saw a bunch of names I've never seen before as I was flipping through things this evening, and I appreciate everybody else who came this evening for the first time, and I hope you'll join us again. Fred, thanks again for your expertise.
My pleasure.
And we'll hope to see everybody again soon. Have a good night, everybody, and please stay safe.
Thank you very much, Eric.